Between 1932 and 1933, the Soviet regime under Joseph Stalin engaged in an intentional act of genocide against the Ukrainians. This event, known as the Holodomor, or death by hunger, killed between 3 and 4 million Ukrainians in just a year. This is a 3-part series in which you will learn how the famine started, how it was covered up, and then finally, how it was brought to the light.
The communist philosophy that the end justifies the means has caused pain out of all proportion to the pitiful social progress communism's achieved. It has not hesitated to use force wherever possible to impose itself on unwilling people and to hold them in abject subjugation. Communist conspiracy is a deliberate and predictable plan of action to subvert the world. In the traditional motion picture story, the villains are usually defeated. The ending is a happy one. I can make no such promise for the picture you're about to watch. The story isn't over. You and the audience are part of the conflict. How we meet the communist challenge depends on you.
Ukraine is a frontier nation, lying along the traditional boundary between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East. Despite its ties to the West, it has been treated as the birthright of Russia for much of its history. The Russian Empire treated Ukraine as a colony, settling ethnic Russians within its borders and extracting its resources for its own use, namely grain. For centuries, Russians have feared an independent Ukraine and have tried every means available to destroy Ukrainian identity. The 19th century was the era of nationalism. Ethnic and linguistic minorities within bigger empires began to demand the right to their own states. The numerous empires of the era tried to tamp down on these nationalisms to preserve their own political cohesions. Russia's strategy was to culturally integrate these regions into the greater whole. In the Russian Empire, this policy was Russification, which focused heavily on language. They discouraged the teaching of Ukrainian and encouraged the teaching and learning of Russian. Intellectuals of the 19th and early 20th centuries tried to justify these policies by labeling the Ukrainian language as uncivilized and barbaric, while Soviet intellectuals would later claim that it was backwards and reactionary. The Ukrainians were hit just as much by nationalism as other peoples of Europe at the time, and the first step for them was the preservation of language. They created schools that taught in Ukrainian, started Ukrainian publications, and wrote entire operas in Ukrainian. But as the Russians tried to clamp down on the Ukrainian language, the products of Ukrainian culture became more political. As Europe plunged into the First World War, the feelings of nationalism were initially muted, but as the war started going south for the Russian Empire, they re-emerged alongside the class struggles of the late imperial era. First came the February Revolution, which removed the Tsars from power and replaced them with a Republican placeholder government under the leadership of Alexander Kerensky. Despite popular demand, the Kerensky government didn't move to end the war against the Central Powers, because it had neither the authority of divine right like the czars, nor the popular mandate that comes from a democratically elected government. So the plan was to hold out in the war long enough to hold an election and let that government make peace. But Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks had other plans. Lenin returned to Russia in October of 1917, and on November 7th, his Bolshevik party in Petrograd initiated a coup against the government of Alexander Kerensky, which began the Russian Civil War. Prior to the October Revolution, a new state had been formed in Ukraine, which had all but declared independence for itself.
However, the Ukrainians didn't want to become part of a wider empire program for land redistribution, fearing that it would be controlled by Moscow and that all the most fertile land would be given to ethnic Russians who would continue to oppress the Ukrainians.
The Ukrainians were supported in their bid for independence by Germany, who occupied large portions of Eastern Europe. Other areas would also declare independence, such as Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And when the Bolsheviks attempted to invade Ukraine in the winter of 1918, the German army pushed them back. Lenin's government would be forced to recognize the independence of Ukraine after signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March, but this did little to stop the Soviets from trying to reconquer Ukraine as the Germans began withdrawing their forces.
It was under German occupation that the Ukrainians began to enact pogroms against the Jews, and unfortunately, they only ramped up after the Germans withdrew.
Many Jews had come to live in Eastern Europe due to pogroms and evictions by Western European governments in the Middle Ages, which forced them eastward into the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. As the Commonwealth was gradually picked apart by its neighbors, the Jews within its borders became subjects of the Russian Empire. Prior to the First World War, most Jews living in the Russian Empire were forced to live somewhere along the frontier between them and the rest of Europe, called the Pale of Settlement. Along with being forced to live in the frequently war-ravaged plains, they were also forbidden from owning land, and could only engage in artisan labor. When World War I broke out, many Jews had to flee their homes in the Pale of Settlement, which meant groups in the empire, including Ukrainians, were now in more regular contact with Jews.
After the February Revolution, the Kerensky government abolished all of the anti-Jewish laws, which allowed Jews to serve in the government jobs and as well as officer positions in the military. However, as formal anti-Semitism within the law began to fade away, the informal anti-Semitism of the peoples, especially the peasantry, began to grow.
The immediate cause of this psychotic hatred, symptomatic of a society in moral and psychic crisis, was the sense that whereas everybody else had lost from the revolution, the Jews, and they alone, had benefited from it. It was a fatal conjunction. For most Russians, the appearance of Jews coincided with the miseries of communism, and so was identified with them. Despite the Ukrainians being a deeply religious group within the Russian Empire, the pogroms had little to do with their religion or even ethnicity. Jews benefited from the revolution because the laws that specifically oppressed them were lifted, but because Jews were kept out of formal society and government for so long, many, especially those who had abandoned their Jewish religion, joined revolutionary movements. Prominent socialists such as Leon Trotsky were Jewish, and whenever Red Army gangs entered a Ukrainian town, they tended to recruit local Jews into their ranks. The anti-Semitism amongst the Ukrainians at this time had more to do with their anger towards the Bolsheviks than the Jews. Once pogroms in Razgrani became the order of the day, it was inevitable that Jews would be the principal victims. They were seen as aliens, they were defenseless, and were believed rich. The same instincts that led to the destruction of the country estates and raids on kulaks led to violence against Jews and their properties. The civil war in Ukraine heated up after the German withdrawal, as nationalists and communists began to fight and form their own governments. The nationalists received material aid from Austria and Germany, as well as the newly independent Poland, and were able to drive the Bolsheviks out for a time, but they eventually returned and defeated the White Army, the anarchists, and the nationalists.
But why was it so important for Lenin and the Bolsheviks to retain control of Ukraine? Well, the most cynical answer would be the same as the Tsars: grain and access to warm water ports. But it was more than that.
Within socialist and Marxist circles, there are a number of intellectual debates, usually formulated as the X question. You may have heard something called the Jewish question, which is most popularly associated with the far right. But socialists ask the same kind of questions, which usually are about how a particular characteristic of a group can get in the way of achieving their political goals. For those of the far right, the Jewish question is about how can a people who are geographically spread out, landless, and have little loyalty to the country they are living in be trusted citizens of a nation-state. This question possesses a number of anti-Semitic presuppositions, and what little truth is underneath them only exists because Christian Europe actively disenfranchised the Jews for over a millennium.
Well, socialists have similar issues, and their version of the Jewish question is also based on stereotypes.
Can the Jews, who speak a different language, whose religion actively separates them from the rest of society, and who are part of an international system of bankers and financiers, be relied upon to destroy capitalism and establish socialism?
This perception of Jews is just as anti-Semitic as the far-right version. It encapsulates the stereotypes that Jews don't belong to the wider society, and that they are part of the greedy money changers of the temple. Socialists, communists, and Bolsheviks all talked about how racism and anti-Semitism were tools of the capitalists to distract the working classes from uniting to overthrow their real enemies. But this didn't stop them from holding their own weird double standards on race.
When anti-Jewish pogroms began to break out in Ukraine, Lenin and the Bolshevik leaders remained silent on the issue, because they were afraid of pushing the Ukrainian peasantry into the camp of the White Army. Within the territory the Bolsheviks controlled, they tried to stamp out overt anti-Semitism, but not because it's an ugly form of racism, but because they saw it as a disguise for anti-communism. Both the Red and White Army leaderships condemned anti-Semitism in general, but they never got more specific about individual culprits. Lenin went so far as to say that not all Jews are class enemies, but he never specified how to tell a non-class enemy Jew from one that was. And at the end of the day, the only institution in Russia that unequivocally condemned the pogroms was the Orthodox Church.
Related to the Jewish question were the national question and the peasant question, both of which addressed similar concerns.
The national question asked about whether the cultures of particular nationalities were compatible with socialism, while the peasant question asked if the peasant class was culturally compatible. Both of these questions would merge into the Ukrainian question. Ukraine was rich in agriculture but not in industry, which meant that most Ukrainians were from the peasant class. Because the Ukrainian language and culture had been repressed by the Russian government, Ukrainian culture developed an anti-Russian characteristic. On top of this, the peasant class was quite independent. They preferred to handle their own problems at the local level.
These two cultures combined made Ukraine difficult to govern in the centralized communist state that the Bolsheviks wanted to create. And in the eyes of the Ukrainians, Sovietization was just Russification under another name. And Lenin was aware of this.
On the one hand, he wants a large centralized state with the resources and coordination to fight the capitalists. On the other, he's aware that this large centralized state would be built against the wishes of minorities who had been subjected to Russian rule for centuries, and to force them into a union with their former oppressors is bad politics.
In this new socialist state, he granted minorities the right to secede from the Union, which he referred to as national self-determination.
Initially, Lenin did not believe any of the national minorities would take him up on the offer. He was under the impression that the capitalists had economically integrated the Russian Empire so thoroughly that none of the national minorities could afford to secede, but he was wrong. Most of the national minorities wanted out of his new socialist empire.
But luckily for the Bolsheviks, Lenin was intellectually dishonest, because you see, alongside national self-determination, he had another principle: proletarian self-determination, which, according to Lenin, superseded the former.
By this he meant that if, contrary to his expectations, some or even all of the borderland areas chose to leave Russia, a Bolshevik government would have the right to bring them back into the fold. If a national minority wanted to exercise their right of national self-determination in order to undermine socialism, Bolsheviks outside the nation had the right to use force to bring them back into the Union.
Basically, you're allowed to leave, so long as absolutely nothing changes when you do. After all, who is the arbiter of what proper socialism is? Lenin. So yeah, it didn't take long for Lenin to violate his own supposed principles.
After the Civil War, he began to initiate some of his desired collectivization policies, but these failed miserably. Between 1921 and 1922, there was a famine. This was partly due to a drought, but it had mostly to do with the Civil War destroying the countryside, both the Red and White armies conscripting peasants who would normally be farming, along with the destruction of incentive structures. Lenin's first plan failed so badly that not only did he have to allow an international relief effort to come into his country to distribute food, but he had to renege on his nationalization policy and allow a level of free market enterprise at the local and regional level.
Communism cannot be built without the fund of knowledge, technology, culture, but they are in the possession of the bourgeois specialists. Among them, the majority do not approve of the Soviet regime, but without them, we cannot build communism.
He also had to allow them to handle their own cultural affairs, because they were the ones in the strongest position of all of the national minorities at the end of the Civil War. Unfortunately, though, these were all embarrassments to the Bolsheviks and Lenin, which is why when his successor Stalin came to power, he made sure that this didn't happen again.
After killing off, undermining, or exiling his rivals, Joseph Stalin took supreme power in the Soviet Union in 1928. Despite denouncing his rivals, including Lenin's former right hand Leon Trotsky, Stalin borrowed his plans for rapid industrialization. The USSR needed to purchase capital goods from foreign countries that it couldn't manufacture itself. However, the Soviet Union had a major hurdle. The ruble had zero value outside of the USSR. This was due in part because the Soviet ruble had no objective value within the USSR itself. Prices were centrally controlled and thus were disconnected from any market signals. On top of this, there were no financial institutions willing to lend money to the Soviet regime, who were deemed untrustworthy due to their reneging on the debts owed by the pre-revolutionary government. This meant that if the Soviets wanted to purchase Western machinery, they needed hard cash in the form of pounds, francs, marks, and dollars. To procure these funds, Stalin needed to export something that Western countries wanted: grain. For centuries, Ukraine had been the breadbasket of the Russian Empire, which exported tons of grain across Europe. The plan was simple: take the grain from Ukraine and other agricultural parts of the Union, sell it to Europe for cash, and then turn around and use the cash to buy heavy machinery. But that's easier said than done. In Ukraine, most of the peasantry were smallholders, farming on their own plots of land and selling the grain themselves. Stalin needed to take control of the land and the farmers, so he issued the first 5-year plan, a policy for rapid industrialization by mandating production quotas for agricultural products and manufactured goods. The success of the manufacturing segment of the economy would be dependent on the success of the agricultural part. The plan called for collectivization, which had been briefly attempted under Lenin, but ended due to famine and inefficiency.
The first step was reintroduction of grain requisitions, meaning that every peasant household had to provide a certain amount of grain to the government every year, and unfortunately the amount that they were usually allotted was too much for a single household to produce by themselves. And so whenever the peasants failed to meet these quotas, Stalin blamed the kulaks, a class of people who did not exist before the revolution.
The old massive landowners of the Tsarist period were gone, and their land had been redistributed to the peasants. Some of these peasants later sold their land to other peasants when they decided to move into the cities or flee the country. But by this point, there were no large private landholders like in the old days.
The official definition of a kulak, according to Soviet authorities, was somebody who could afford to hire help to work their land. Unfortunately, what this definition tends to ignore is the fact that these kulaks tended to work their own land alongside their employees. Stalin blamed the kulaks for the failures of the 5-year plan, accusing them of withholding grain from the government.
Stalin began to push for greater collectivization. Peasants were forced to either give up their land and join a collective farm, or fulfill even higher quotas, many of which had trouble fulfilling them before. Most of the smallholders gave in and joined the collective farms, but the larger landholders initially held out, but they would face a campaign of intimidation, harassment, and false accusations. Party activists would go around and threaten many with violence, raiding their homes and taking whatever food was there to meet the quotas. And if they couldn't, they were either forced to join the collectives or accused of sabotage.
Over 1 million Ukrainians were either executed or sent to the gulags due to kulak-related accusations. In fact, the campaign of dekulakization was so successful that Stalin received complaints from peasants across the Soviet Union about it. Stalin responded to these complaints in an article he wrote for Pravda.
The Soviet government's successes in the sphere of the collective farm movement are now being spoken of by everyone. Even our enemies are forced to admit that the successes are substantial, and they really are very great. We had overfilled the 5-year plan of collectivization by more than 100%. But the successes have their steamy side, especially when they are attained with comparative ease, unexpectedly, so to speak. Such successes sometimes induce a spirit of vanity and conceit. People not infrequently become intoxicated by such successes. They become dizzy with success, lose all sense of proportion and capacity to understand realities. Why should we consolidate the successes achieved when, as it is, we can dash to the full victory of socialism?
Stalin didn't just have the party activists on his side, but also the scientists. They believed that with Marx's concept of scientific socialism, they could outplan reality.
There was an acute shortage of capital. Too many projects were begun simultaneously, and sufficient resources to finish them were lacking. The price of wheat, which the USSR exported in order to pay for its imports of foreign machinery, fell from 8.63 rubles per hundredweight in 1929 to 2.57 rubles in 1933, while prices for the machinery Stalin purchased rose by 55%. At the same time, Ukraine's agricultural burden was out of proportion to what it produced. It is daunting, with hindsight, to find so many great figures of Soviet biology queuing up to endorse collectivism, a movement that starved millions to death and was used quite deliberately as a weapon to obliterate an entire class of moderately well-off peasant, decimate the Ukraine, Russia's troublesome satellite, and subjugate the Soviet countryside.
A smaller famine occurred between 1931 and 1932, to which Stalin responded by sending grain to the needy regions. However, an even bigger famine would emerge later that year. These famines, driven by inefficient economic policy of the Soviet Union, drove more small landholders into the collective farms in hopes of finding food. Unfortunately, they would find only more of the same.
As grain shortages continued, Stalin ramped up his blaming of kulaks despite the fact that, by official Soviet definitions, there were none left. Rather, kulak became a shorthand for anyone who didn't support collectivization or the regime. The few smallholders that were left were accused of being kulaks, sometimes by party activists and other times by their neighbors, who were often being rewarded for helping uncover class enemies. And not only were they accused of withholding grain, but also of actively sabotaging the collective farms by burning crop stores and breaking tractors and threshers. As the famine worsened, peasants became more desperate. At first, they were forced to choose between killing what little livestock they had left for food or to keep them for later. Many began eating the fodder meant for the livestock. They ate bark off of trees and roots from the ground. In order to buy food in the cities, which were kept better stocked than the countryside, peasants would rob the graves of the old elite, which occasionally had gold or silver buried with them. They also began stealing wheat from the state granaries.
This became so frequent that Stalin issued the infamous Law on Socialist Property in August of 1932, which punished theft of grain with imprisonment or execution.
The peasants were sometimes allowed to keep a greater portion of their harvest if they outproduced their quotas. But in November of 1932, when the famine started getting worse, the peasants were forced to return the extra grain. The state police and party activists were sent to homes to take grain and anything else that was edible. By this point, theft from the grain stores had become so common, it was presumed that any food found in a peasant's home must have been stolen. They were also required to hand over any livestock they may have, or pay a huge fine. In response to this, many peasants decided to kill what livestock they had left, considering they couldn't afford to keep it anyways. It wasn't just smallholders that were raided by the state and party. Collective farms that failed to meet their quotas were forced to fulfill even higher quotas. Party activists raided these farms and took anything edible they could find. These collective farms were blacklisted, which meant they were not allowed to trade or receive any deliveries. The party bosses in Moscow began to put pressure on local party leaders in Ukraine, threatening them with not just loss of position within the party, but with imprisonment in the gulags if they couldn't get their region to meet their grain quotas. Party bosses in turn sent out more party activists to break into peasants' homes and find even more food. Anyone who resisted or was unable to fulfill their quotas was accused of being or aiding the kulaks. In January 1933, the borders of Ukraine were sealed off in order to prevent peasants from fleeing to other republics. There was no food in Ukraine, and Stalin was making sure the Ukrainians couldn't find any outside of it. And for an unfortunate number of desperate peasants, they resorted to cannibalism. Peasants that were sent to cities died on the streets begging for food. In Kiev alone, over 9,000 dead bodies were cleared from the streets in 1933, but less than 4,000 of them were officially counted as deaths for state records. The others were disposed of without formal recognition.
Whether the Holodomor is a genocide is debated by scholars. However, it was, in fact, entirely man-made, and entirely the result of central economic planning from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. If that's all it was, then it would serve as the ultimate argument against socialism, communism, or at the very least Soviet-style communism. That would be bad enough. But the evidence substantiates my view and that of a number of other historians that Joseph Stalin did indeed engage in genocidal efforts against the Ukrainian people. Joseph Stalin frequently received letters from people across the Soviet Union, and we know for a fact that he was receiving letters from people in Ukraine in the fall of 1932, telling him that there was no food. In fact, in July of that year, the party bosses of Ukraine told Moscow that they could not meet the grain quotas.
The Ukrainian communists continued to press for further concessions. The Ukrainian officials argued that the quotas were too high, that the Ukrainian peasants were starving, and that the agricultural crisis was objective. Stalin's representatives blamed the Ukrainians for the crisis, rolled out any further concessions, and ordered the plan to be fulfilled unconditionally by January 1, 1933. All Komsomol members in Ukraine were purged for violating party discipline and arrested. Stalin and the leaders of the Communist Party knew that famine was happening. And what did they do? They intentionally made it worse. They put policies in place that didn't just call for procuring more grain, but to take food away from those who had it.
They created an atmosphere that incentivized starving the Ukrainians to death by sending people into their homes and stealing what little food they had left. And then they blocked off all the roads, preventing Ukrainians from leaving or supplies from coming in, making sure that not only could they not find food, but they also couldn't leave to tell people what was happening.
The Holodomor was the most successful genocide in the history of mankind when it comes to achieving its intended goals. Stalin got the grain so he could export it, get heavy machinery, and industrialize the Soviet Union. On top of this, they collectivized the farms, which makes the peasants and food supply easier to control.
Furthermore, they were able to debilitate the political threat that was the Ukrainian national movement by starving between 3 and 4 million Ukrainians to death in a 12-month period. And they were able to do it all the while keeping it hidden from the rest of the world.
In the years that followed the famine, Ukrainians were forbidden to speak about what had happened. They were afraid to mourn publicly. Even if they had dared to do so, there were no churches to pray in, no tombstones to decorate with flowers. When the state destroyed the institutions of the Ukrainian countryside, it struck a blow against public memory as well. There was no official acknowledgement of the famine. The Soviet authorities referred to any such claim as reactionary propaganda meant to undermine Soviet communism, and the denial of the famine began before the worst phases of it had even begun.
You weren't supposed to talk about the famine. Doing so could find you on a one-way trip to Siberia or lined up against the wall and buried in a shallow grave. But that didn't stop the rumors from spreading amongst high-ranking families in the Soviet Union, those who benefited most from the starvation of the Ukrainians. The word was never officially banned, but it was unofficially censured by a culture of obedience and fear.
Members of the Ukrainian Communist Party would use the word in private communications, but while discussing it in public or at conferences, the word could get you killed. Instead, they had to use euphemisms such as problems or difficulties. One brave Ukrainian party boss from Kharkiv, Roman Terekov, was bold enough to use the word famine in front of Joseph Stalin. Stalin responded to this assertion by saying,
"You spin this yarn about famine thinking that you'll intimidate us, but it won't work. Go to the Writers' Union and write fairy tales for idiots to read."
Not long after, he found himself removed from the party leadership in Ukraine. Records are silent on what happened after. After the roads leading out of Ukraine were closed off, Ukrainian soldiers serving in the Red Army stopped receiving mail from home. Ukrainians who joined the army after the famine were publicly rebuked or punished if they brought up the famine. A Ukrainian soldier who joined the Red Army in 1934 was attacked by his political instructor when he asked about the famine.
There was no famine and there cannot be. You will be locked up for 10 years if you keep talking like this.
During the famine, many Ukrainian peasants stopped working altogether because of malnutrition. In order to bring in the harvest, Moscow sent students and other volunteers from the cities to the Ukrainian countryside in order to collect the grain. What they saw traveling around Ukraine was horrifying. Miles and miles of untilled fields with empty houses with dead bodies on the sides of the roads. The students and workers were under strict orders to never speak of what they saw in Ukraine.
At work, no one spoke of the famine or of the bodies in the streets, as if we were all part of a conspiracy of silence. Only with the closest and most trusted of friends would we talk about the terrible news from the villages. The rumours were confirmed when the townspeople were ordered to the countryside to help with the harvest, and saw for themselves whence had come the living skeletons that haunted our city streets.
As the deaths piled up, doctors were roped into the conspiracy. Doctors were told to invent other causes for the death from the famine. Infectious disease and cardiac arrest were common. It got so bad that even village party secretaries were swollen with hunger. An atmosphere of fear and blind loyalty motivated the silence among doctors. It was considered to be anti-party, reprehensible, even to react to them.
The death registration books were removed from many villages. The party claimed that the kulaks had taken control of death reporting and were artificially raising the numbers. On the back end, whether or not someone was willing to fabricate death records became an unofficial test of loyalty to the party. Those that refused could, at best, find themselves out of a job, or at worst, find themselves in a mass grave, buried with the peasants they weren't willing to lie about.
Despite trying to silence the doctors, students, workers, soldiers, and public functionaries, the Communist Party had another problem: the census. Soviet planners had made charts and graphs forecasting greater population growth. Keeping these numbers would prove to the world that the Soviet system was truly the best. The population of the Soviet Union and of Ukraine were certainly higher than they were in 1926, when they took the last census. But in 1937, the numbers were much lower than anticipated. The total had grown from 147 million to 162 million. The planners had forecasted the population being somewhere between 170 and 180 million. A committee collected the data for the census, and then Stalin edited it. He was angry at the data, especially at the much lower population levels, with particularly low rates in Kazakhstan, the Volga, the North Caucasus, and Ukraine, the areas hit hardest by the famine. The committee in charge of the census ordered thousands of villages to be surveyed in order to find the missing 8 million people from the population estimates, and found fewer than 5,000. The men running the census were arrested in March of 1937, accused of being class enemies. They were replaced by a new set of men who were shortly thereafter arrested as well. This continued until Stalin found a compliant set of statisticians who were willing to fudge the numbers. The 1937 census was never officially published, and a new census was released in 1939 that claimed the Soviet Union had grown to over 170 million people, hitting the low end of the projected growth rates.
How did they get these numbers, you ask? Well, what they did was they applied the census data from the gulags to regions of the Soviet Union that were hit hardest by the famine in order to pad their counts.
On top of this, Joseph Stalin had over 120,000 ethnic Russians resettled in the regions of eastern Ukraine depopulated by the famine. But this wouldn't be enough to fix all the numbers in Ukraine, because the census also asked about nationality. The statisticians claimed that the number of Ukrainians seemed to not grow as much as the other national groups because many Ukrainians stopped self-identifying as Ukrainian and identified as Russian instead. Stalin had this to say about the new census.
Under the sun of the great socialist revolution, an astonishingly rapid, never-before-seen increase in population is taking place. Mighty socialist industry has called into life new professions. Tens of thousands of people, who yesterday were unskilled laborers, today have become qualified masters in the most diverse branches of production. Millions of peasant smallholders, eking out a beggarly life, have become prosperous collective farmers, creators of socialist harvests. The all-Union census of the population must show all of the great changes that have happened in the life of the people, the growth of the cultural and material level of the masses.
Despite all these repressions, the Ukrainians did keep the story alive. It became part of the oral tradition of the Ukrainian countryside. Many kept diaries of what happened in those years, diaries that had to be kept secret from the authorities, hidden under floorboards or buried in the yard, because if you were found in possession of such a record, you could find yourself on a one-way trip to the gulags. But some Ukrainians managed to escape the Soviet Union and tell their stories to outsiders.
Now, keeping a crime like this hidden inside your own totalitarian state is simple enough. But what about the rest of the world? Well, luckily for Stalin and the Communist Party, they had willing collaborators among foreign journalists and heads of state. all willing to ignore these crimes for their own ideological and political motives. And you'll see more of that in part 2 of Conspiracy of Silence. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.